Coming up on Garden Talk.
The AI is people training those systems. Then everyone could have the power of those expert opinions via computer vision without a person actually looking personally at their plants. One of them would be a pH either increaser or decreaser. You typically don't need both. You'll find you want to correct one direction only. I built 6 scales, which are all Wi-Fi enabled or part of the system, and every minute they report their weight. You really shouldn't actually have a clogging issue if you always have a pre-filter, by the way, for your pump. Automation is there to help you, to enable you, and to do a lot of the things that you don't want to do.
What's up, everybody? If you that don't know me, my name is Chris, aka Mr. Grow It, and you're tuned into the Garden Talk podcast. This is episode number 37. In this episode, I interview Simon, the creator of the Plant Studio. Many of you like to automate your garden in some way, whether that be through auto watering, environmental controls. There are so many different things you can do to automate your garden. In this episode, we talk about the future of gardening, complete automation. Simon has developed a way to just about completely automate your garden, so you, the gardener, can be hands-off most of the time. Thanks to all of you who support this podcast through Patreon. If you'd like to support, you can do so by going to patreon.com/MrGrowIt. Before we get into it, I want to acknowledge that one of my goals for this podcast is to bring zero cost for information about gardening, all plants, to the general public. That being said, I'd like to thank the sponsors of this podcast who help make that goal possible. Big shout out to Dutch Pro for sponsoring this podcast. Dutch Pro is a plant fertilizer company that has been around for over 30 years. They have base nutrients, and they also have additives such as PK boosters, root stimulators, CalMag, silica, a nutrient optimizer, and a foliar feed. They also have pH regulators to help ensure that the nutrients can be uptaken properly. I will leave a link to Dutch Pro's Amazon store down in the description section below, and you can use coupon code MrGrowIt10DP for a discount on their products. Thanks to Spider Farmer for sponsoring this podcast. They have board-style LED grow lights, bar-style LED grow lights, grow tents, inline fans, and carbon filters. They also have complete grow tent kits, which include lighting, a ventilation system, grow pots, a trellis net, a timer, and a monitor for both temperature and humidity. Coupon code MrGrowIt5 will get you a discount on their products, and I'll leave a link to their Amazon store down in the description section below. A big supporter of this podcast is AC Infinity. They sponsor this podcast, and I use their products. AC Infinity now has gardening tools and accessories such as heavy-duty fabric grow pots, trimmers, grow room glasses, drying racks, plant ties, and trellis nets. They also have all of the equipment needed for a ventilation system. I will leave a link to AC Infinity down in the description section below, and you can use discount code MrGrowIt during checkout for a discount on their products. All right, we are back. Welcome to the Garden Talk podcast. Today I am joined with Simon. He is the creator of the Plant Studio. How you doing today?
Great. Thanks for having me, Chris.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. My voice is still a bit raspy. Apologize for that. Luckily, Simon will be doing most of the talking in this episode, so you won't have to deal with my raspiness. Yeah, I'm excited for this one today. We're going to be talking about the future of gardening, so complete automation. You've done quite a bit of work with an automated system, box, whatever you want to call it, an indoor grow setup called the Plant Studio. And before we get too far ahead, you're going to be talking all about that today and just automation in general that can be applied to, home grow in particular, I feel like. Before we get into the details on all of that, though, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of how you got into this space?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Simon Romanski. I'm live in Massachusetts. I'm originally from England. That's where my accent comes from. I've been growing for a few years. I think I got into growing. I mean, I'm a technical person, so I think I got into growing when I was in Disneyland. I think it was Epcot, and there's a ride called The Living Land, which is a ride that goes through a greenhouse. And I remember looking at all these different methods of growing, and it just looked very technical, and it just, I was blown away by it. And in particular, I remember the aeroponics section, they had these plants on this track that would revolve around, and they would be suspended. They're just holding the plants, and the roots are just dangling in the air. Then they would take them through this little chamber where they would get their their water and nutrients, basically. And I just was blown away the fact that, plants could even be grown that way. So I think it's always been the technical, the interesting, different side of growing that I found interesting, and really what got me started, at least. I do think a little differently after growing. It's not all about the hydroponics. I'm definitely a fan of lots of other, living soils and things like that. So, but that's basically where I really think I got my start from.
Nice. And I know before we started recording, you talked about how you went to school for, is it engineering, mechanical engineering, or software engineering? Or can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, I went for it was information management and technology, and basically I went to Syracuse, and it's a cross between computer science and management. So I always say I don't consider myself a programmer, but more of a developer. So I like making solutions with technology as opposed to just, I don't write the drivers for stuff and all the super technical stuff, but there are so many tools and frameworks and APIs and things out there that I love kind of putting stuff together in order to solve problems. So that was what I went to school for, and it's been a fit for me ever since.
Gotcha. You talk about what you just mentioned. It kind of relates to what I used to do. I used to work for Amazon.com, worked in the fulfillment center for 8 years. I was actually in their support side of things too, working with worldwide operations. But one thing that they do in their fulfillment centers, and I'm sure there's some people watching this that have worked at Amazon or work at Amazon right now, but they pound in your head like the process improvement side of things, like streamlining. So my mindset has always been like, how do we make things more efficient? How do we automate things to reduce the amount of labor hours that are put towards a process?
Yeah.
So kind of
that was actually my first job was working in fulfillment. I worked at a fulfillment center, and I liked the order and inventory management and the back end, seeing the packages and the orders and inventory came in. And basically what I did for this company is I kind of webified them. It was dating myself a little bit. It was a while ago where people were still like the internet. Some people didn't even have dedicated internet access, continuous internet access. And I basically had wrote some web tools and a web application to allow clients to look and check on inventory and orders themselves without having to call the customer service rep. Because when I started, all these calls were coming in. I thought, well, that's crazy. Why are you calling? You should be able to just look that up yourself. So that's kind of where I began, was really fulfillment. And again, I just like the solution providing. I like going back in the warehouse, because I worked in the front office, and seeing were those pack slips, or did it make sense for the pick, pack, ship part of the fulfillment? And so, yeah, that's similar also with the fulfillment.
Yeah, so definitely some similarities there. And then you took those skills and now you've applied them to horticulture, which is pretty cool. Can you give us a high-level overview of the plant studio that you have created?
Yeah, sure. It's a cultivation machine, and it's basically there to control everything above the ground and below the ground. It's not really ground, pots or chambers or whatever your grow method is, but basically root zone and environment above. And the whole point of it was really to automate as much of the time-consuming stuff as possible, because when it comes to watering, I would forget, or if I'm away, or if if you're doing hydroponics and you're wanting to monitor the pH or water levels and temperatures and stuff like that. So basically, I did it so that I didn't have to spend as much time doing the stuff that I didn't enjoy doing. I didn't mind the plant manipulation stuff, but I don't like the stuff where you have to constantly stay on top of it, or having to go and manually change things in the room environmentally in order, because, the temperature's too high or the humidity is off or something like that. So that was basically my, I always say I'm inherently lazy, but I'll also go way out of my way to try and automate and to simplify it for myself.
Gotcha. And actually on your website, I'll mention it right now so people can check it out if they want to and kind of get a visual of what we're about to dive deeper into. It's www.plantstud.io.
It's Plant Studio, but it's you don't even need the W's. It's plantstud.io. And so couldn't get the .com, but I kind of like the .io makes sense in a way because it is all about, input and output. So it's Plant Studio with the dot before the IO.
So check that out if you are interested, and then I'll have the link in the description section below on YouTube, so you can easily access that. There's a great video right on the homepage which talks about just a ton of things within a very short period of time about all this automation. So let's dive deeper into this. Let's start with the grow area. What size grow space is it? And what is the Plant Studio made out of?
So the grow area it's a 5x9, and it has so basically a 2-light setup, and it's 8 feet tall because height always becomes a big issue when growing. A lot of people, especially indoors, are limited by the height size. I'm pretty fortunate to be able to have pretty high ceilings. The overall dimensions inside the grow machine is 5x12, but that extra 3 feet of space is there to accommodate, the air conditioning, dehumidifier, fans, and basically the equipment that helps manage the environment and gives me some space to actually to get inside the machine to tend to the plants. And the machine itself the box itself is made by from insulated panels that I came up with. It's basically wood that is sandwiches some high density insulated foam, and then these panels slot together to make to make a well insulated and sealed box. So they, it's not your typical stick construction like frame where people frame it and then put it up and then insulate it. These are like panels.
Okay, so this is a sealed environment. Just to confirm, it's a sealed environment. You don't have an intake vent, an exhaust fan. Everything's just kind of recirculating within that environment. Is that correct?
Yeah. I actually learned this the hard way because my initial grow was I didn't have any. I wasn't considering any kind of air circulation. I mean, that's how clueless I was. And I went away. I came back, and I was growing tomatoes in the early days. And I basically came back, and it was just a horrible stink. And I didn't know. I thought something was rotten. And basically, I realized that when you basically drown or just deprive the plants, not drown actually, it's like just remove all the CO2 from the air, they are not happy, just like we wouldn't like, getting rid of our oxygen, and they just make an crazy smell. So when I smelled and I realized, I go, oh, I need to change the air, then I realized I had two different choices. And you can and that's a lot of the choices. It's like, do you circulate? I mean, do you have a sealed room, or do you circulate and bring in the outside environment? And in the end, I just decided that a sealed room is just much easier to control and to maintain, because I'm not dependent on an outside environment that I'm then pulling into that room. Sometimes it might make sense. It's cooler outside. I can bring the air in and it could cool it down. And the humidity builds up quickly. And sometimes you go, well, we've got to pump the air out and get rid of that extra humidity. But then you're dependent on that outside environment. So the trade-off, though, is then if you're dealing with temperatures, typically you're going to be dealing with cooling because the lights put off heat, it's insulated. So now you have to cool the heat of the lights. You have to cool that excess heat that comes off the dehumidifier because it does still put out heat despite the fact that it's got the cooling side. It overall generates more than it removes. But again, the benefit was also controlling the environment, not pulling any pests or any pathogens potentially in. The tricky part is making sure that you can size the equipment so that it is able to deal with, say, late stages of growth where your plants are big and they're putting off a lot of, they're transpiring a lot, and there's a lot of humidity, and the lights are full bright, cranked up, and that's a little, that was a little tricky. But I would say that my one tip is, as far as people being able to size correctly, you take the wattage of all the things that you have in that box and then multiply that by 4. And then whatever number you get from that is basically how many BTUs you would need to remove that you would get. So for me, I had about 3,000. My machine running at full capacity with both lights on, with the air conditioning and the dehumidification running. And when I'm running the large dehumidifier, is about 3,000 watts max that runs. So 3,000 times 4, 1,200, 12,000, excuse me, and 12,000 is considered 1 ton. So I have a 1 ton mini split, and it's actually more than capable of cooling because, with your watts, that is for also heat watts. The like light, a lot of that is going into your photons and it's not coming off directly as heat. So it's good to more oversize. You don't want to go too big, but you definitely have to make sure that you can keep up with the heat and the humidity in the sealed room.
That makes sense. And just to reiterate, you said 2 lights that you're running, LEDs. And according to your website, they come in at 2.3 micromoles per joule, so you got some good efficiency there. I know people are going to be asking this. Can you tell us what diodes and driver you're using for those lights?
I don't know. I've had these for a few years. They're the Fluence the Spider X Plus, and they don't actually even make these bars anymore, which is almost unfortunate because I'm definitely a big fan of the bar style light fixtures. Because I believe it's most closely represents the sun. And when it comes to penetration of the light for your plants, if you've got my whole ceiling, basically, there's 16 bars that go from the back to the, all the way across the grow area. And the sun is basically like a giant beam coming down. It's not as much as it is a spotlight. It's a point. As far as we're concerned, the photons are coming. They're not coming from a point. It makes a lot more sense. And the other thing I liked with the LEDs is that you can get them a lot closer to your plants. Depending on what style of LEDs that you use, it will vary how much your photons drop off based on the distance. Because the Fluence don't have the lenses on these the diodes, I find that the drop off in your PPFD is really the photon rate drops off a lot. If you just, for every foot, you bring it up. So, I do play around with dimming the lights, but then also being able to bring the lights down closer to the canopy, using less electricity, generating less heat, less air conditioning required to cool it. But again, towards the end, those lights are just cranked up, and the plants, they don't care. They want as much as you can give them.
Gotcha. That makes sense. A couple more things about the actual equipment and setup before we dive into the actual platform. So with a sealed environment, generally speaking, I think a lot of people know this, is you got to run CO2. I believe you're running CO2 tanks inside the studio. You must have a humidifier, dehumidifier. Can you talk to us about the equipment and then also air circulation? Can you talk to us about how all of that is kind of set up within the space and how the air circulation is achieved in there?
Yeah, so the CO2 side of things, I have two tanks that sit outside. They are piped in, and the CO2, which naturally drops, there's two tubes above the fan, which sits at one end of which is the machine side of the system side of the studio. That blows the CO2 and circulates it around as it's needed. I have a sensor that can be raised and lowered manually from the machine side that I keep at basically canopy level. So that CO2 sensor is basically, I do run elevated CO2 levels, which is a big benefit of having a sealed room. And the other thing is that because the room is so well sealed, that for an entire grow, I won't use maybe 10 pounds of CO2. And I think a lot of people struggle with tanks, saying, well, I'm burning through tanks all the time. But when the room is really well sealed, it's a minimal overhead. I did have one situation where my tank did run out, and what I ended up doing was, I have a secondary tank. When it detects that one tank is when the tank is on and the system sees that the CO2 levels aren't rising, it will then assume that tank is empty and then flip over to the secondary tank, because again, what happens if the CO2 runs out, and you don't want to just change out your CO2 before it totally depletes, just in case, because you've got extra CO2 in there. You might as well use it until it's gone. So I have the redundancy on the CO2 and the air circulation. Currently, I have a fan an oscillating fan, and it's a small room, and it does really well at keeping pretty good airflow in there. I also have a carbon filter, and it pulls the air from lower down and basically goes up. It's a 10-inch pipe, and then shoots that air over the plants also. So it's kind of constantly stirring. But even with those two systems, I find that I think I could improve on air circulation. So my next upgrade is I will have two tubes going along the sides on the floor and along the ceiling, which are connected for the entire length of the box. And then I'll be circulating the air from the underneath and pulling the cool air from underneath, bringing it up to the ceiling, and sending it out that way across these long pipes. So it's not just blowing out, it goes down the pipe and then comes out all the holes in the pipe to give trying to get more of a laminar flow, because they said with CO2, for the plants to really benefit from it, it doesn't need a lot of agitation, but it just needs constant air movement. And it's the stagnant areas within the canopy that become the problem. It doesn't always require just big fans blasting everything, just enough slow movement, and the plants are supposedly fine. That's what I've been reading. I do a lot of research, and then I come up with try and come up with a solution to see if that actually helps. And I'm still playing with the idea of, am I going to take the air from the top, bring it down to the floor, and let that, hot air, will that rise? Or would I be better off doing it the other way around? But it's easy enough to flip the direction of the fan, and I'll be experimenting with both ways and figure out which works best, I guess.
Okay, so that's CO2 and air circulation. Now for the humidifier and dehumidifier that's controlling your relative humidity, and also the heater and the air conditioner that's controlling the temperature, are those pieces of equipment inside the box or is it outside the box?
Everything is inside because
Everything except for the CO2 is inside?
The tanks for the CO2 are external, so that gets pumped in. I mean, all the electric work is I have actually a sub panel on the outside, and then conduit that goes into the surface mount boxes for the outlets, and even those are sealed with foam so that no air escapes. So yeah, the dehumidifiers inside. That's also one. Currently, I'm still using a regular dehumidifier, and I found that when the plants were smaller, I did better using a smaller dehumidifier, so that it wasn't cycling as much. And then as they get bigger, I switch to a larger dehumidifier. And then when you can also, the great thing with the box, it can also be used for the, post harvest and the drying phase. And when that happens, then I actually switch to a desiccant based dehumidifier, which is able to deal with the cooler temperatures. It doesn't have the volume, but you can have a much cooler temperature and remove. I found it's just a lot more efficient for power usage, and it just works a lot better. So I also am planning on incorporating a larger built-in ducted dehumidifier, so that again, to give more control. You can get dehumidifiers these days that are Wi-Fi based, so you can see if it's getting, if your humidity is getting too high, you could remotely go in and lower that. And again, with the bigger systems, there's always a control panel interface where you can then take some electronics, and I could then take my computers, my environment controller, and have those directly control the dehumidifier, rather than just having it constantly on and turning it on and off with turning the outlet on and off, which can be done, but isn't really an ideal way of doing it.
Gotcha. We'll get deeper into the environmental controller and the studio platform in a minute here. Last thing I want to cover is, can this system be used for soil, cocoa, and or hydroponics?
Yeah, because really the environment itself, which is just your air temperature, humidity, and CO2 levels, doesn't really mind what method that you're using to grow. Aeroponics was my initial, because I thought, well, it's a great way the roots get tons of oxygen this way, and I don't have to deal with a media at all. And so that's one less thing to deal with. And I've had great success using aeroponics. And it is kind of a crazy way of growing, because you mist the roots for 3 seconds every 3 minutes. And besides that, they're just dangling in the dark. And, this is high pressure aeroponics. This is not like your typical cloner that has those little red nozzles just spraying constantly. This is a highly atomized mist with special nozzles, and it's very fine, and the mist, the emitters are at the bottom, and as they fire, they circulate, and it really swirls around inside, and it stays suspended for a while before it even settles. So it's a great way of basically touching all the different, like all the parts of the root and getting great coverage. But again, my last grow was in Coco, which was just a departure. I wanted to try something different, because I didn't want these big chambers and plants locked into a chamber. I wanted to have some flexibility of plants and being able to actually move them around. And so I did a cocoa grow, and my next grow is actually going to be using a living soil. And I've got a whole new system set up that I think is going to be interesting to see, what I can produce using that setup.
Gotcha. That's pretty cool that you built in the flexibility to be able to use the different types of mediums like that, right? Because they are certainly different in numerous ways.
Yep.
And you've incorporated the different ways within the Plant Studio platform. So could you talk to us about the Plant Studio platform?
Yeah, the platform, this is almost the hardest part to understand of the system, because this is where it's like my background as a web developer is it's the computers, and there are three computers inside three computers for the grow system. One of the computers is controlling the lights, the temperature, the CO2, humidity, managing basically everything above when do the lights come on and off, and what's your nighttime temperature, and what CO2 levels, turning the CO2, making sure the CO2 doesn't run at nighttime. So that's the environment controller. The reservoir controller, separate system, totally non-dependent on the environment controller. That it has the manages or monitors the pH, your EC, temperature, the depth, sensing all the different attributes of the reservoir. And the way it actually does that is I have a circulation pump, and it pumps through a PVC pipe, and that's where the sensors are. So instead of putting the sensors actually in the reservoir itself, it circulates the reservoir and senses those variables, the values, as it does so. And the idea was also when I do dosing and things like that, it also serves as the circulator is also a mixing system. And it makes it easier if you wanted to switch something out. And also with the reservoir level going up and down, how do you, making sure your sensors are always in the water is obviously important. So the system is able to fill and drain itself automatically. And this was something this is one of those ones where I just got tired of trying to, I didn't want to carry buckets around and empty it. That's the pain that is hydroponics. And so it can drain almost totally empty the reservoir, but also when it fills it, I can then specify how much I want to put in. And I actually do everything based on liters instead of gallons. And it's not because I'm English, because I did grow up with, I do think of everything in gallons, but when it comes to dosing, everything seems to be done in milliliters. I mean, sometimes you would get those tablespoons, or is that a tablespoon? Is that a teaspoon? And but now it's all milliliters, and a liter is 1,000 liters. So it gives you a better idea of proportions. But again, it's been great that when I go to fill it up, 25 gallons is maybe close to about 80 liters or something like that. So I just say 80 liters, it just puts that water in, and then I go and dose from there. And so, the dosing side of the reservoir controller, which again, this little computer controls, I have 5 pumps, and you can choose whatever liquid you want to mix in. And typically you'd have your A and B, multi-part nutrient, and then maybe some micro, I have a CalMag, and then you'd have, one of them would be a pH, either increaser or decreaser. You typically don't need both. You'll find that you're going to drift in one you want to correct one direction only. So, one of them is a pH adjuster, and the other are all nutrients or additive based. And those inject in line with that circulator. So after it goes by your temperature, your pH, and your EC, there is, and you'll see it in the video, it's the clear acrylic piece of pipe. The drops going in, that's dropping into the circulation of the of where the where the sensors are basically. So that's the reservoir controller. And what's nice is with the computer part of it then is like I can then specify a program and saying, all right, at this time, empty the reservoir, put this many liters into it, dose this much into it of A, wait until you see that the ppms has stabilized so that you know that it's well mixed. And then once you see that the EC has stabilized, then go into your next, your B nutrient. And then once that's stabilized, you could specify time or say, let it see if it's stabilized before doing the next one. And then it goes along. And then with the pH, again, you can, a lot of it is just algorithms, different algorithms for pHing. And, but the whole thing is basically set my reservoir up so that it's ready then to feed the plants. So that's the reservoir controller, totally independent of the environment controller. But then for the human side of things, now that's the controller, it's like the human interface. That's where you can manage. It's pretty basic. I can go in and turn the lights on, turn the lights off with a, and I could turn the fans on, circulation pumps, and what have you. So that's that computer is to control it, but then also to monitor it, because all this information, every single minute, the system reads every value. And so in a day, I'm getting about 40,000 data points at every minute. What is the temperature? What's the EC? What's the air temperature? What's the CO2 level? What's the depth of the reservoir? What's the air conditioner or the watts of the dehumidifier? Because I track the power usage of things like the dehumidifier, because that enables me to see if I've sized it correctly. If I see that thing is peaked and running all the time, then you're going to need a bigger dehumidifier. Or it's set up incorrectly where it's short cycling because something's blowing on it, or it's just not moving the air properly. So the human interface part is, again, it's gathering the data, but also it's what, and again, you can see in the video, it shows the graphs. It's what I'll put up in my bedroom up on the TV, and I'll be, live streaming. I have here's exactly it's showing, gauges what my current pH is. And if it gets too high, it can send off an alert, but it also changes. So I have everything kind of green. When things start going red, that's a problem. So also with this human interface component computer, it allows me to go back at any point in time of the grow and see exactly at that stage what that environment was. So it gives me history for analysis. So every grow, I have all that information. It might seem overkill to say, well, you don't need to do it every minute. But with some of these systems and these time series databases and things that they have out there, it's not that much information. It's not a high def 4K video that's streaming. It's got more bandwidth in probably a minute than you'd have in an entire grow. So if you can gather that information, why not have it? And again, it's very easy to then go back and with a mouse, I can just select a certain time span, and it shows me all the stage, all the readings from all the sensors at that point in time. And I think it's just a really useful thing to have. So that's really what people, and I spend my most time using, is the human interface. The other things just do their job. I'm not there I try and, they manage the system.
Gotcha. You uncovered a lot there.
Yeah, no.
So you have a lot of control with this Plant Studio platform. I mean, guys, check out the video that is in the link in the description on the website. You'll see exactly what we're talking about, what Simon just explained with the graphs and so on and so forth. Now, for the reservoir controller, you said that's controlled on one computer, and it really sounds just so hands-off. I know a lot of people are probably listening to this, and their ears are really perking up because it completely automates feeding entirely. and you can have several different bottles hooked up to this, and it can dose and it can wait for things to be stable. Then it could do the next dose and then wait. And it's just, I've never seen this level of automation before, particularly on the home grow side of things. I know there are some commercial operations that are automated. I don't know how automated they are, but for the most part, the fact that you can actually control the water levels, right? Your hands off on the water level, your hands off on dosing nutrients, your hands off on pH, right? And then you're even hands off when it comes to your environment completely, because you have an environmental controller. I was going to ask you where the probes are located within the space, but you have basically a controller of probes that hook up to the environmental controller that's going to automatically turn on and off your humidifier, dehumidifier, air conditioner, heater, in order to control those measurements, right? Those variables.
Yep.
Where is the probes located for like CO2 and temp and stuff?
That's the one that is hanging. I have conduit that goes from the environment controller, which sits just to the left of the wall-mounted mini split, and it basically goes along the ceiling right into the middle of the grow area. So as I that's not automated, the raising and lowering of that sensor, but that sensor is the temperature, humidity, and CO2 sensor on a wire, basically. So that is hardwired to the environment controller itself.
Gotcha. And then one other piece, which I think you might have briefly covered it, is, and it's shown in the video, is it automatically is calculating your energy consumption and putting a dollar sign to it, right? So it's telling you, literally, it's having how much water you're using, putting a dollar amount to it, how much you're spending for water, nutrients, dollar amount, electricity consumption, dollar amount. So you're getting down to that granular level. That
will vary based, obviously, on where you live. In the New England, water here is pretty cheap. California, I know that's a different story, and the electricity is the biggest resource. I track the electric, the CO2 usage, the water, and the nutrients. Because you know how many milliliters you put in of each nutrient, I also have a database saying, this is the nutrient I got. I spent this much for the nutrient, and it has this many milliliters in it. So I know on a per milliliter, how much does that nutrient cost on a per milliliter basis. So when I feed it, I know how much that feeding even cost. My electric cost, when it is really cranking for me here, is about $5 a day is my cost. And by having a sealed room, the AC and the dehumidifier are kind of close to the other half of the lights. So that is the price that you pay. I have been thinking about, ways of, using the winter, the cold outside. Can I use that as a means of dehumidifying or cooling without directly bringing that air in, using some kind of a chiller system and making it more efficient? However, for simplicity's sake, having everything in the room just is definitely the way to start. And a sealed room, I think, is a good way of starting. You can always go to air exchange if it makes sense, if the environment is conducive to that. But again, I'm about knowing that it's totally controlled and not being able to have an excuse and saying, well, that was a hot day and all the humidity's been killing me. This box could be run in any environment, as long as the ambient environment where the reservoir is obviously doesn't get below freezing. I have a heater, I have a chiller for the reservoir, which is outside of the studio box itself. So that's something that, again, I'm constantly trying to improve the efficiency of the resources used for growing. And, that's why I'm also excited to try out doing a soil grow next, because, my last grow, I decided to put each plant on a scale, and the
So I was going to ask you
scale.
about next is if you could talk about the scale side of things, because that's pretty mind blowing as well.
Yeah, so and that's even changed from that grow until now. Initially, the idea was, how do I, when to water plants? A lot of people would say, well, you pick them up and you get a sense of how, the weight, and gives you a better sense than just trying to stick your finger in the top and feeling how dry the soil is. And so I built 6 scales, which are all Wi-Fi enabled or part of the system, and every minute they report their weight. So when I fertigate, I was using these covers that have 2 misters in them, and it would water all the plants at the same time. And it worked great in the beginning, but and the nice thing is I could see also by doing that all the plants were actually getting water. If one of them were to clog, I've never had a clogging issue. You really shouldn't actually have a clogging issue if you always have a pre-filter, by the way, for your pump. I'd always recommend you have to put a pre-filter on the pump. That really almost mitigates clogging issues. And so all the plants I could see would be getting a liter, a couple liters when they were smaller, and it was very accurate. They all got the same amount. Their weight would all increase. But then as one plant would overtake and have different water requirements of the other, now I'm like, well, I don't want to give them all the same amount of water. One needs more than the other. So I'd end up taking some of the misters and I'd say, hey, give it to this guy so he gets extra and he gets one less because there was 2 misters per plant. But now you're going away from the whole automation thing. So my latest setup that I actually haven't run yet is a manifold. It's like an irrigation manifold, but it's also why it's controlled by the reservoir controller that can say, send water only to this plant. So now I can water each individual plant separately. And what that's going to allow for is, you can try different experiments. I could let some plants, if they're all clones, then that would be almost ideal because you could really then understand different watering patterns and how they affect those plants. Do you want to do a deep watering less frequently, small watering more frequently? And the other part is that also because it ties into the reservoir, I could then potentially mix in the reservoir a different mix potentially for each plant. So I could put in, and I'm actually going to have to downsize the reservoir a little bit if I'm doing on an individual plant basis. But with a smaller reservoir, I could then mix up some nutrients, send it to plant A, and then I can flush that out or, empty, give it everything that's in the reservoir, empty it out. And then for the next plant, give it a different nutrient and maybe a different quantity. So again, you can then set up different tests, experiments for all these different plants. And that to me is a great way of doing your phenotype hunting, because you obviously, you start with your genetics, but different nutrients, what works for some might not work for others. And this way, I think it's a good way of automating, staying consistent, because I think a lot of people, when you're growing, they go, well, I'm not going to mix up a different batch for each different plant. But if it's automated, it doesn't then let the machine do the work. You just sit and watch and get an idea of, what effect that has. That's still coming down to the person to look at the plants, to see if it's a happy plant or not, and to see what kind of results you get. And that, to me, as far as the gardening, that seems like that's the enjoyable part of it.
That's so cool. That's really, really cool. So the last piece I wanted to have you talk about, which is really fascinating, is the imaging computer you have that inspects the plant health. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so that's actually a separate computer. It's really a small computer that I'd hooked up to an old SLR that I had. And, you want to a good camera with a good lens is going to take much better pictures. And so it's set up so that every 10 minutes of the plant's life, they have their picture taken. And the idea is that it only takes their picture, but it also stores it on that monitoring computer. So at any point in time, not only could I go back and saying what was I feeding or what was the EC and pH, but you can also see how the plants looked. And the thing that I actually found that, I mean, originally I did it because I thought it was just kind of cool. I was like, everyone likes a time lapse. I don't know if you've seen the Amazing Fungi show on Netflix, and all those time lapses are just mesmerizing.
Yep.
And the cool thing is, I think when you feed your plants, you can't see how they're doing at that point, how they're responding. But if you put it in a time lapse and you get to look at them over that, even over one day, you got your 6 pictures an hour, and in a day you get to see, did they seem to respond well or not? Because people seem to have a good sense of a happy or a non-happy plant, and definitely seeing the growth. You can watch it within one day. It's pretty easy to see growth, just even at a 10-minute interval pictures. So again, it's partly I thought it was cool, but I found it really useful. So then I'm able to run a script, and at the end of the day, it can just generate that day's time lapse. Or I could say, give me over the last 3 days, or from the beginning of the grow until now. So I watch time lapses all the time just to get a feel for the plants, and just because it's kind of cool to watch also, I guess.
Yeah, that is really cool. I don't do as many time lapses as I should. A lot of people like to see the time lapses in videos, and I don't do many of them. I've only done a handful of them. I know there's a lot of content creators that do a lot of time lapses, but that's really cool that you're able to add that into your automated system, and for plant health purposes, so you can see how well your plant is doing as far as the health of the plant.
Yeah, the other part, as I should have mentioned, is it's also a great way of, again, if you have a high enough res picture, being able to take something and then maybe identifying plant issues that you're having, deficiencies, you overwatering, is it underwatering? Like sometimes you can look at a plant and you get a sense of that. So that's also something I continue to grow. I do want to get it so that I can get in closer on the individual leaves, so that you can start to identify what might be going on with the plant itself from a health standpoint. So that's the other aspect that I think is useful. Ideally, I'd love to tie it into some kind of a computer vision where the system can kind of look and go, oh, that looks like you've got a calcium deficiency. That looks like that's, it's been overwatered or underwatered, or whatever the problem may be. And again, I know some people might say, well, that's going to take an expert, a person, in order to be able to identify that. But people have to realize too that with the computer vision, a lot of that stuff and the AI is people training those systems. So it really is a person takes pictures and they say, this is this problem and this looks like that problem. And after you've given the machine enough of those, it gets better at identifying it itself. So then everyone doesn't have to be an expert on that. You can have experts who have identified these issues, and then then everyone could have the power of those expert opinions via computer vision without a person actually looking personally at their plants. So I do think that the AI and the machine learning stuff is a fascinating and definitely we'll definitely be seeing a lot more of that. And it's already being done quite a bit also.
Nice. So when will this plant studio be available, and how much does something like this cost?
It's not currently available, unfortunately. And it's something that it's difficult because it requires, it's a large box, it's a large machine, but also requires an electrician. to bring in, a circuit. I have a 30 amp, 240 volt circuit going to a sub panel. And again, I'm not an electrician, so I had to have an electrician hook that up. If you have the mini split, depending on the distance that you're running it, you might have to, you'd have to have someone come in who has access, who can charge it with the required refrigerant to get that going. So it's kind of like, putting an addition on a house or something. You need like these subs who can all do their part, to get everything going. It's not to say I wouldn't like to get to that point. And that is also why I've made a lot of the reservoir controller itself. I didn't want to cut out with wood, so I actually got a CNC machine, learned to use a CNC machine, designed it, had the CNC cut all the parts out, and then put it together. So it was a perfect fit. So it works well for replication. I've never replicated it again using that yet. I've still, because I've been getting into the details of the software and stuff, but and it'd be pretty expensive because a lot of the components that I use are really good. But one thing you have to keep in mind is you need good sensors to get good data. If your pH sensor is not accurate, it's garbage in, garbage out. So you need good quality information. And if you want the efficiency of the air conditioning, you need something that's going to have a high SEER rating. It'll cost you less to run it. You could do it with less expensive units and stuff. So I know it's not exactly answering your question, but it is something that I do think about, and I am definitely working on it for sure.
Gotcha. Yeah, even if it was just individual components, whether it be the controllers or even like the software, right? I'm sure people would love, I'm sure people are listening to this salivating at how the software is and how, automated it can be, if it was a plug and play version where you could attach your own equipment that you have in your grow space to the software. I think that would be extremely beneficial. So hope to see something like that in the future. Yep. So wrapping things up, how can the listeners find you and what do you have upcoming in the future?
My easiest way is to email me is, my email is simon@romanski.com. That's, SIMON at romanski.com. Plant Studio, plantstud.io is my, website. And, I'm planning on I want to do more social media and interact more with people, like-minded people out there, or even people who could complement what I do. I don't consider myself to have a green thumb. I am able to automate, and I've learned a lot from YouTube and listening to shows like yours as far as the cultivation side of things. But my angle and what I bring really is the systems and the automation to it. So, I'm basically I also want to help people understand that automation, it seems complicated. And some people go, well, it's also prone to error. And if that doesn't work, then it's going to, then what's going to happen to my grow? But I think most people will find that it is there to help you, to enable you, and to do a lot of the things that you don't want to do. I'd say don't carry a bucket of water from one to another. Even something as simple like using something like some of these diaphragm pumps you can get for $50 that has a built-in pressure switch, so you can stick a hose in a bucket and it self-primes, it pumps the water and sends it to where you want to be. Use something like that. Don't make it hard on yourself. So use some of the stuff out there, enjoy it more. I would start at least monitoring, get an inexpensive camera to look at your grow, and you could even pan over to a temperature and humidity sensor that's just a standalone sitting there. And now you can remotely see it. And you can get these cameras for like $35 that can pan and tilt. They want you to get the subscription for it. But if you're just doing a live view to check on your plants and see what the current environment is, why not do that? It's a very inexpensive way of being able to kind of have some remote access to your grow and to give you some hopefully comfort that everything's going well. So, that would be my advice for people. And again, people feel free, if any of this is interesting and would like to reach out to me, please do so.
I'll leave a link to Simon's Instagram page on Instagram as well. I'll link that down in the description section below. And also a link to the website will be down in the description section below. If you enjoyed this video, click that like button. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. Release episodes every single weekend. I'd love to know in the comment section, what type of automation do you have in your garden? Let us know down in the comment section below. Lastly, if you are tuning in on Apple Podcasts, please leave a rating and review. We are coming up to, I believe, 200 ratings and reviews, so almost there. Need your help to get there. And thank you to everyone who has left a rating and review so far. Simon, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast today. This has been an eye-opener and a sense to know that there is this automation being worked on and things will be easier for people in the garden, particularly indoors. And I'm excited for the future. So thanks for coming on. And
thank you so much, Chris. I appreciate you having me on to talk about this stuff. And thanks a lot. It's been great.
Absolutely. All right. Enjoy the rest of your day.